I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, in case you're wondering, I'm recording in beautiful Warm Springs, Virginia, home of the oldest spa in the United States, which is named for Jefferson, who soaked in it, loved it because it helped his rheumatism, and then it gave him boils on both butt cheeks. So he was kind of a mixed Yelp review. But Ben Franklin also loved it and did not seem to be so afflicted, and he's my hero anyway. So I'm going to check it out in an hour. In the meantime, I'm going to do an episode on authority, Palestine, and Gabor Mate. This will continue a conversation that I've been having with Guy Duperreault on words and the authority of words, and also continuing and embedding a video that I did on 4 interviews that Russell Brand had with Gabor Mate, which my video was called the Epiphany Jumpstart. So I'm going to embed that here, but also elaborate particularly on the one that it responded to where they're talking about Israel and Palestine. So let's get started. I'm going to begin with a conversation that I had with a parking lot attendant. It started out amicably enough. We even got through talking about things like vaccines, things like politics and Trump, and we navigated those rapids and were able to come out on the other side. And then we hit Israel. With Israel, what he said was, Israel has a right to defend itself. And I said, an ethical position cannot contain proper nouns. So do all people have the right to defend themselves? He then went back to Israel exists. What happened was many, many years ago. And so now that Israel holds that territory, it cannot be attacked without retaliation. And according to him, Israel never goes into Palestine and sends bombs there. So we will just overlook that. But getting back to the principle of it, I said, well, how long does someone need to hold it before they have ownership? At what point is possession ownership? Like if I go into your house with a gun and I say, this is mine now, you all have to stay in the garage. Is that then mine because I own it, or is there some period of time? He went back, brought in many different examples, kept changing the subject, talked about, well, what about Texas? Does Mexico have the right to take Texas back? So I think that this is actually a key to how we're becoming so confused, is that the original sin for the United States and every non-indigenous inhabitant in it is that we are colonizers, we are immigrants, and we are immigrants who took over. And therefore, do we have a right to criticize Israel for doing the same thing? And then you have the flip side, which is that the indigenous argument is being used once again as a weapon. That in Australia, they have, I think, defeated something that would turn an indigenous committee into an unelected authority that then would be able to dictate things to everyone else. So that's where I think we're being confused. And to complicate that issue further, if you say that only if people are still living who were affected by that rather than later generations, do you end up with something where if you kill everyone, there's no longer a claim on it? And I think that's what is at work right now with Israel's agenda with Palestine. To introduce this section on words, I have changed into this t-shirt that says, I see you, I hear you, I am with you. And my friend says it has one too many words. It should be, I see you, I hear you, I am you. Guy Duperel and I have been continuing our long-form conversation in each other's Substacks, where now we're talking about words and about who has authority over what they mean. His position, as I understand it, is that the one who possesses it at that moment is the authority on what that word means, that words are living things and that they change. You can see I'm being bombarded here, that they change in their meaning as things drop from the sky and that person says, this is what it means now. When I use a word, as the Red Queen said, it means exactly what I say that it means. Who is to be master? That's the question, and that's all. So when I look at words, I say that the authority of what they mean is the author. And as far as you can go back to the original author or whoever coined it at that time. And I always love etymology for that reason, but it's also part of what I meant when I was talking about tonic masculinity and how it can't be turned into its opposite and say, well, now I'm the possessor of it, therefore it means whatever I say that it means. I used what I thought was an absurd reference at the time in one of my comments and said, well, what if Monsanto took over the word regenerative? And no sooner was that out of my mouth than it seemed like it happened. I think that illustrates that words need to be able to have a touchstone, somewhere to go back to say, here is what the author meant by it. The example that I gave in my book was Susan George, the economist, who said that the word ecologos, that logos means intent or purpose, and that nomos is the set of rules that govern it, the way of fixing or defining it. And her position is that the purpose needs to supersede the set of rules governing it. So I think that this can be applied to many, many things. Certainly it applies to money, that forms of money, including digital currency, aren't good or bad. What's bad is the purpose for which it's been designed. And then we look at words, and that words can be shifted to be malevolent or benevolent in their definition and their meaning and the set of rules that they imply. Technology, the same thing. There are so many ways in which technology could be beneficial. That we were talking about Luddites, and the Luddites were not just reacting to technology, they were reacting to technology with a malevolent purpose of egocentrism, of taking labor and making it serve the accumulation of wealth in as few hands as possible. So I think that we have all these tools and that the tools need to be used to dismantle the master's house. They're not just a means, it's the end that they're being used for that we object to. But just because we object to the end doesn't mean that we should throw out the means. I was reminded of my video on Gabor Mate because recently the clip of his interview with Russell Brand talking about Palestine has been making the circuit. And I think that is one of the most beautiful and human and touching accounts that I have ever heard. So I'll be including that in my Substack. In the 4 interviews that I respond to between Russell and Gabor, they are far-ranging. So I talk about religion, faith and spirituality, Palestine, politics, pandemics and parenting, Aboriginal art, the three brains of the body, and anthropologists from Mars. At Gabor's suggestion, I delve into The Globalization of Addiction by Bruce Alexander of Rat Park fame, and on the dislocation common to slavery, money, and addiction, bringing in David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years. Bruce's essay, What Shakespeare Knew About Addiction and We've Forgotten, looks at addiction as a semantic palimpsest and its connection to devotion. In his second existential crisis, he calls for epical social change as the only way to bring about psychological health. I find that Gabor and I share a go-to deadly sin, and I analyze his marriage with much admiration. I begin by talking about the second greatest force in the universe, which I think is a person who changes their mind, and I end with the most powerful force that I call the Epiphany Jumpstart. Let's look at this. I'm Teresa Caraggio, and this is Third Paradigm, where primarily I respond to Russell Brand's Under the Skin podcast, where he interviews various people. In this video, I have utterly failed. I have one viewer, Milan Innocent, who's been sending me extensive notes that she's taking on my videos. And it is such a delight to hear my words reflected back and realize that someone's getting them at that deep level. It's also made me realize how complex they are and how many points I'm trying to make. So I had resolved that I would make no more than 6 points in this video. And then Russell interviewed Gabor Mate, one of my favorite people in the universe. And when Russell asked his producer, Jen, well, what's an example of a healthy addiction? She says, I think to binge listen to all 4 episodes we've recorded with Gabor. So of course that's what I did. So now I have 5 hours of 2 of my favorite people discussing so many different topics. So we're going to be talking in this episode about religion, faith, spirituality, Palestine, politics, pandemics, and parenting, about Aboriginal art, anthropologists from Mars, and the 3 brains of the body. And in particular, we'll talk about addiction and dislocation and their relationship to slavery, and then about giving away our power and authority. Let's get started. To give a framework on my discussion of Gabor, I want to start with a question that a listener named Maurice asked. He wanted to know, is religion something you see as false, and is faith different than religion? On another Substack I subscribe to, the question came up of religion and spirituality. What I posted to that was that religion was a set of answers given by a hierarchy, and that spirituality to me was about finding the right question. If religion was what I feel it should be, it would be a forum for asking the big questions, but that doesn't exist. In another episode, I talk about my parents and how they were very humble people, but they gave over their own authority to the Catholic Church, and that gave an avenue for them to be manipulated because they didn't think it was right to think for themselves. They felt that they needed to identify, to give over their own identity, their own authorship of themselves to someone else. So that kind of hierarchy where we feel that we are only special and we're only worthy if we identify with a group that excludes others, I think that's a very dangerous thing. If I were to look at faith in that kind of God, that God would be a projection of the ego. But if I look at the true, my feeling of what faith is, it's faith in your fellow human beings. It's faith in each other. I've never found a way to criticize a child without the parent taking offense. So if that's not possible here, how can we be so critical of other people as the children of God and think that that's not an insult to God. So if we want to have an inclusive sense of our identity and our grandeur, rather than the grandiosity, as Russell describes it with the deadly sins, of just having an exclusive group, then I think we need to be looking at our faith as a collective and the kind of God that is not exclusive, and a focus on asking and finding the right questions. I have been giving some thought to what I call the second greatest force in the universe, which I think is a person who changes their mind, particularly in an area with which they identify, where they have given over their own identity. I see Gabor as doing this twice in his life. Once as an academic and doctor, when he recognizes that his patients are really no different than him, even though they're addicts. The second is when he, as a Zionist youth and as someone who lost his grandparents in the Holocaust and who was severely traumatized as a child by the Holocaust, he comes to recognize that a land without people for a people without land is a myth. I have loved Gabor since the first time I heard him on Democracy Now!, but I never loved him more than hearing him speak out about Palestine. The title of this was Trauma in Israel, and that made me think, we're just going to be going down that same road of the Jews as eternal victims, the only ones who can have everything excused and who deserve to have the security of their own land, which nobody else seems to get. And instead, what Gabor gave was a personal and heartfelt account of going to Palestine and crying for days. I think that kind of testimony is the most beautiful thing that I've ever heard, and it made my heart sing. When Gabor talks about taking this position at great personal cost, he says the truth that's in you must come out, otherwise you are hemmed in by frustration. In another episode, I found out that Gabor and I share the same go-to deadly sin, which is envy, in his part of people more successful, and in my part of people who are successful at all. He says that you should get conversant with the resentment and say, "What do you need, sweetheart? What's missing for you?" I love that, and I think maybe he could get conversant with that hem of frustration and have it say to him, "Where do you need to go, sweetheart? Who do you want to be with other than me?" And so being in the self and looking at what the truth is and how it resonates, not just with the head and the heart, but also the gut brain, as he describes. Now, I think of the gut brain as Horton Hears a Who. There's 7 billion microbes, and who knows how many other things that are contained in each of those. So we have the entire universe in our belly. We are the one mind, and staying with that and not feeling the imperative to action that if you come to a certain conclusion, you're going to have to go talk about it, do something about it. That creates a way that is a hindrance, I think, to coming to a place within yourself of saying, what's the truth? In the privacy of Gabor's 3 body brains, I'd like to ask him to go even deeper. At one point, he's talking about the ethical codes of different religions and says, and Judaism, of course. And Russell interrupts to say, I'm not going to give Judaism an of course. Thank you, Russell. I think that questioning whether Judaism is a cult of superiority based on the exclusion of the Canaanites in particular, and whether the God is a projection of the empire's ego. And then Gabor is reading a history of Hitler and talking about how because of capitalism, people have come to distrust money and that has made some into hating the Jews. That's a connection that is often brought up when anyone is talking about money and the creation of money. Gabor is in a unique position where no one can call him a Holocaust denier. He could be asking, what's the history that we're missing here? Why are these two things connected? That would be a service to saying what would have led a person of good mind and good heart to have voted for Hitler in the first place. In Damaged Leaders Rule an Addicted World, I loved Gabor's statement that for society to function, it has to separate the soul from the body. And I loved his recognition that Obama got more money from Wall Street than anyone, and that they knew exactly what they were getting. Someone who was committed to killing abroad, but in a way that was urbane, that was sophisticated. He says that Obama bailed Wall Street out as soon as he went into office. I would correct him that he bailed them out before he was in office. Unlike Palestine, where he said there was nothing he could do about Operation Cast Lead because he wasn't yet president. And the day of his inauguration, that was when it ended. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think also that Trump is, as Gabor says, the naked, ugly face of capitalism. He reflects exactly what it is that's going on and says it without obfuscation. And so Trump is revelation, and that is really his sin, as Gabor says. I also loved Gabor's statement that in order to really understand the way things work, you need to approach it like an anthropologist from Mars who doesn't work with the assumptions that people are evil, selfish, greedy. That's exactly what I do in my book, How to Dismantle an Empire. What I say is that people are good, and when they behave badly, systems are to blame. I even, in one chapter called What If Money Was No Object, take the position of a puzzled space alien, looking at things without understanding what money is, and wondering why it is that the people who sit in comfy chairs and make nothing end up getting the best and the most, so much that they throw the biggest part away immediately, which is the box, and the rest of it follows soon after. And those who are hardworking and make and grow things have the least and send what they make away to other countries where obesity is a problem. So for the puzzled space alien who doesn't grok the existence of money, this is a mystery. And as if I didn't have enough to respond to, then he mentions The Globalization of Addiction, a book by Bruce Alexander. And when I look him up, he is the Rat Park guy, the person who changed the entire paradigm of addiction in 2 syllables. So he is fascinating. What he's talking about is dislocation and addiction, and how in some societies you'll have that happen as a crisis, but in our society, dislocation is a way of life. And so we're always being ripped from our context. The primary influence on my book is David Graeber, and this book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. In it, he talks a lot about the pulling people up by their roots, that a person cannot be made into a slave unless they're ripped from their context, from all their familial relationships and their community. And so he follows that from the concept of debt as an anthropologist to how money has done that as a matter of course, incrementally. And I look at how there are 2 ways to make a slave. One is to take a person from the land. The other is to take the land from a people. And so that enables us to be able to live by renting slaves by the hour rather than the inconvenience of needing to buy them by the life. I think that that does not only rip them from their context, but rips our souls from our bodies, because we can't live without being a part of that. Bruce has some fascinating essays on his website. One is What Shakespeare Knew About Addiction That We've Forgotten. In it, he reviews a book on addiction and devotion that looks at religion as having been a form of addiction, and that he calls addiction an semantic palimpsest, a stone that's been written over and erased that can be deciphered for what went before. So the author has seized devotion and human need for attachment, passion, focus, and says that we need those things that both shape and unravel identity. Isn't that beautiful? So she sees us as having a dual nature to our souls, where on the one hand, we need to be free and have independence. On the other, we need to be attached and devoted and have that kind of determination. In another essay, he gives a talk where he says he's in a second existential crisis. He has been diagnosed with cancer, and he's not afraid of death, but he doesn't want this world to be the one that is left to his grandchildren. And so he sees epical social change as the only thing that is going to restore us to psychological health. And at the same time, he critiques Jordan Peterson for, I think, the same reason that I did, where Jordan says that in order to criticize society, first you have to put your own house in perfect order, and that is an impossible task, and that we can't really live ethical lives until we've made society something where that's possible for everyone. I couldn't agree more. Then I read the first chapter in Gabor Mate's book, Hold On to Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers. It would take me an entire book to say all the things that I agree with on this. And part of that book I've written called Don't Get Mad, Get Even, How to Raise Giving Kids in a Taking World. This is the story of my last 20 years running interference between my kids and their friends and making sure that I kept our family culture as something that was in the forefront. Our society makes this so difficult. When we talk about ripping kids from their context, that's what schooling is about. And I've been quoting from John Taylor Gatto, who says that the purpose of mandatory schooling from 1930 was to destroy the family. Putting kids in a room where there are 30 other people their exact same age to be their mentors and one teacher is a recipe for disaster. So there's a lot that we need to rethink with this. And my episode, Be the Meanest Mom Ever, Your Kids Will Thank You Eventually, talks about it. And it's a good one for people who are not parents to be watching. So if you're parenting currently, I say definitely read Gabor's book. But don't stress about it. Your kids are your kids for a reason. And it's all of us who are going to figure our way out of this. So what you're doing is perfectly good. And the last episode I want to respond to is pandemics and infodemics. This was recorded in March of 2020 when Russell is stuck in Australia with his family and saying tours will be postponed until society can be reordered. He's talking about how long could this last? 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, forever? And thinking that eventually people will start living more in harmony with nature. He's feeling guilty about making decisions about what's the best thing that he should be doing for his family. Now, Gabor is saying, if you're the one making those decisions, you live in a very different marriage than I do. And he's quoting the Buddhists who say, relax, everything is out of control. So I remember March of 2020 vividly because it's the first time in my life I have ever had panic attacks. And this was alarming because my brain is my safe space. So having it turn on me like that was really disturbing. I think that the hints of what was to come were already there, but we were so naive. It's nostalgic to hear Russell and Gabor speaking as if there's no thought that they may not be able to say what they think. But Russell is quoting the WHO saying we need to handle the infodemic, and the Lancet magazine saying this isn't just an epidemic, but an infodemic. What did they mean by that? So before there was even any thought of the information, they were already managing the narrative. So at some point, Russell talks about how the Aboriginal artwork in his hotel, how there's all these energies, vibrating energy fields, and that he feels like that's the reality. And that was also, I think, what helped me at that time, was I knew that this was going to be working for the good of all of us, but it just felt like things were spinning out of control and the ground under me was moving so fast. So in Aboriginal art, I am so fond of it, and I have a book called Aboriginality, and my daughter Veronica and I reproduced this one of their paintings on a plate, and I will someday, when the weather is nicer, show you my coping cabana where I've reproduced another one on the walls. That's a fancy name for a storage shed. I find the relationship between Gabor and his wife to be charming. He says that she's allergic to romance, that whenever he starts looking at her in a certain way, she wants none of it. She doesn't want to be on a pedestal. She feels like that's him creating some fantasy, some projection that eventually she will pay for. And she wants him to see her, for who she really is. And at some point at the ending, Russell says, "So I think you're a bodhisattva." And Gabor says, "Ask my wife if I'm a bodhisattva." And Russell says, "She says you're a pain in the ass." At some point, Russell says, "I feel like we're on the periphery of a great awakening, and what we need is an Epiphany Jumpstart." So I want to say what I think is the most powerful force in the universe, which is two people who are asking the same question, without ego, without competition. That is the question that is a quest. As my viewer Milan says, a quest into unlearning. That's what I see Russell and Gabor doing. They are joined in the question. And that is going to save us centuries in the Great Awakening. If you'd like to see the original of that interview between Gabor and Russell, I'll have that portion linked in my thirdparadigm.substack.com. I also have that Russell Brand was removed from Jeremy Corbyn's poetry anthology. But despite Brand's removal, the book's contributors include many other celebrities with anti-Semitic past. So this is filed under anti-Semitism in the Jerusalem Post. And I think, again, if words are spells, that's exactly what I said the attack on him was for, to shut him up about talking about Palestine. And then there's a 30-minute video on U.S. presidents that show them surrounded by Zionists, Yuval Noah Harari's ready-made speech, and then a compilation of Zionist hate speech against Muslims, also linked there. And then a Truth Seeker article that chronicles the PR disaster of the released hostage of Hamas, who talks about how nicely and considerately they were treated. It contrasts this to the 3 Palestinian men taken in the West Bank who were stripped, beaten, handcuffs, urinated on, burned with cigarettes, and attempted to sodomize with an object. For more on words and communication, this is When Words Die, Worlds Die. And then this is a playlist on Israel and Judaism. Thank you for watching.